April 16, 1945, Kleinstadt, Bavaria. As dawn broke over the rubble-strewn streets, Frau Helga Weber stood clutching her ration card, her knuckles white against the thin paper that promised less than half the calories needed to sustain her family for the week. Through the window of her partially damaged home, she watched warily as the first American troops entered the town square, their olive-drab uniforms a stark contrast against the grey limestone buildings. Among them were black soldiers, men the Reich had spent years depicting as subhuman savages. "Keep your daughters hidden," the local Nazi Party official had warned just 2 days earlier before fleeing himself. "The Negroes are coming." Little did Helga know that within 3 months she would be secretly trading her family heirlooms to these very same soldiers for food to keep her children alive. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how Nazi propaganda collapsed under the weight of human hunger, and how America's segregated military inadvertently became the instrument through which German civilians first confronted their shattered worldview. A transformation that would reveal more about the contradictions of American democracy than either nation was prepared to acknowledge. Obersturmführer Klaus Hoffmann of the SS Propaganda Division stood before a gathering of local Nazi Party officials in Nuremberg on January 15, 1945. The room, once grand with its oak paneling and imposing Nazi emblems, now felt smaller, colder, as coal shortages had reduced heating to a minimum. Outside, the constant drone of Allied bombers had become as familiar as birdsong, punctuated by the distant thud of explosions that no one bothered to react to anymore. The final component of our civilian preparation concerns the Negro soldiers within the American forces, Hoffmann declared, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had delivered similar briefings countless times across the crumbling Reich. "Our intelligence indicates they compose approximately 10% of the advancing troops. These men represent the gravest threat to German womanhood." Hoffmann gestured to his assistant, who distributed pamphlets bearing crude caricatures of black American soldiers with exaggerated features. "The American Negro has been promised German women as reward for his service. This is documented fact." It wasn't, of course, but in the desperate final months of the war, truth had become entirely secondary to utility. Among those listening was Dr. Wilhelm Braun, a local physician who had joined the party in 1933 more out of professional necessity than conviction. Now, after 12 years of Nazi rule and nearly 6 years of war, his skepticism had hardened into silent contempt. Still, he knew better than to voice such thoughts, even as the Reich visibly collapsed around them. "And how exactly should we defend against these forces when our Wehrmacht has retreated beyond the Rhine?" Dr. Braun asked, his tone carefully modulated to avoid any hint of the sarcasm he felt. Hoffmann's gaze hardened. "Your job is to prepare the populace, Doctor. The Volkssturm will handle military matters." Both men knew the Volkssturm, the hastily organized militia of old men and teenage boys, would be utterly ineffective against battle-hardened American troops. The meeting continued with distribution of the latest propaganda materials, detailed instructions for document destruction, and contingency plans for party officials, plans that conspicuously omitted provisions for ordinary citizens. As Hoffmann concluded, he added with mechanical conviction, "The Führer has promised new weapons that will turn the tide. We must hold fast for the final victory." Leaving the building, Dr. Braun pulled his coat tighter against the bitter January cold. Paper crackled in his pocket, the propaganda leaflets he was supposed to distribute to his patients. He briefly considered dumping them in the first bomb crater he passed, but thought better of it. Even now, denunciation remained a very real threat. 350 miles to the west, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams of the 784th Tank Battalion sat cleaning his .45 caliber pistol in a temporary barracks established in a requisitioned French farmhouse. The 784th was one of the few black tank units in the U.S. Army, having been activated in 1943 after years of military resistance to allowing black soldiers into armored units. Despite proving themselves repeatedly in combat since landing in France, they remained under constant scrutiny, their accomplishments minimized, their errors magnified. "Mail call!" The announcement sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. Williams looked up hopefully, then masked his disappointment when nothing came for him. His squadmate, Private First Class Leroy Jackson, however, received a letter that made him whoop with joy. "My son was born," Jackson announced, his face split by a grin so wide it seemed to push aside the fatigue that had settled into all their features. 7 pounds, 8 ounces. They named him Leroy Jr., just like I asked. Congratulations erupted around him as the men momentarily set aside the war to celebrate this small piece of normal life. Williams clapped Jackson on the shoulder. "That boy's going to be proud when he hears what his daddy did over here." "If anyone ever tells him," muttered Corporal James Peterson from the next bunk, "back home, they're still acting like we're not even in this fight." He wasn't wrong. Despite more than 1-2 million African Americans serving in the U.S. military during World War II, their contributions were routinely omitted from news reports. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, rarely mentioned black units, while mainstream American papers relegated their accomplishments to small articles in back pages, if they covered them at all. Williams returned to cleaning his pistol, his movements precise and methodical. "We know what we're doing here. My daddy was in the 369th in the last war. They called them the Harlem Hellfighters, and France gave them more medals than their own country did. Same war, different day." Lieutenant Thomas Miller, the platoon's white commanding officer, entered the barracks and the men instinctively straightened. Miller was one of the better officers they'd served under, not friendly exactly, but fair, which was more than many could say. "Gear up, gentlemen. New orders just came down. We're moving out at 500 tomorrow. We're heading east into Germany as part of the general advance." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They'd been fighting since landing at Normandy, but entering Germany proper, the Nazi homeland, represented something different. "Any specific intelligence we should know about, sir?" Williams asked. Miller hesitated. "Honestly, Williams, it's a mixed bag. German military resistance is crumbling in many sectors, but we're seeing more fanatical last stands too. Volkssturm militias, Hitler Youth, some of them just kids with Panzerfausts, and—" He paused, seeming unsure whether to continue. "And what, sir?" Williams prompted. "Intelligence reports the Germans have been distributing some particularly vicious propaganda about Negro troops, preparing the civilian population to resist you specifically. Just be aware." After Miller left, the men exchanged glances. This wasn't entirely surprising. They'd all heard about Goebbels' propaganda machine and its obsession with race, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a new way. "So, we got the Nazis afraid of us specifically," Jackson said with a humorless laugh. "That's something, I guess." "Just means they'll fight harder against us," Peterson countered, "like we needed things to be any harder." Williams reassembled his pistol with a final click. "Doesn't change anything. We do our job same as always. Let's get some rest before the move out." Back in Kleinstadt, 16-year-old Margarete Weber, Helga's daughter, was filling buckets with water from the town pump. The municipal water system had failed weeks ago after a bombing raid damaged the main lines. Now, fetching water had become a twice-daily ritual, one that Margaret particularly dreaded, as it exposed her to the increasingly desperate atmosphere of a town awaiting invasion. "You should cover your hair," an elderly woman hissed as she passed. "The Americans will be here any day. The colored ones look for blondes." Margaret ignored her. Though she felt a flutter of fear, she couldn't entirely dismiss. The warnings had become more frequent and specific as American forces approached, warnings that conflicted with her own secret doubts about Nazi propaganda, doubts she dared not voice even to her mother. At home, her mother was cutting patterns from an old newspaper to mend Margaret's younger brother's pants. Hans, just 10 years old, was too busy playing with a crudely carved wooden tank to notice the worried expression that seemed permanently etched on their mother's face. "I heard Frau Müller's cousin in Mannheim said the Americans give children chocolate," Hans said, without looking up from his toy. "Real chocolate, not the ersatz stuff." "Hans, who told you that?" Their mother's voice was sharp with fear. "Just heard it," he mumbled, suddenly cautious. Helga set down her sewing and knelt beside her son. "Listen to me very carefully. When the Americans come, you must stay inside. You must not speak to them or accept anything from them, promise me." Before Hans could answer, Margaret set down the water buckets with more force than necessary. Why? Because of more Nazi lies. The same people who promised us final victory while they prepare to run away themselves. Margaret, her mother's face went pale. Never say such things. The walls have ears, even now. The walls are half destroyed, Mother, like everything else they promised to protect, Margaret shot back. The frustration of years of deprivation and fear suddenly finding an outlet. Father is dead, we're starving, and the mighty Wehrmacht is nowhere to be seen. But yes, let's worry about what the Americans might do to us, rather than what our own leaders have already done. Helga stood quickly and slapped her daughter, then immediately pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm sorry, my darling, but please be careful. Whatever you think, keep it inside until it's over one way or another." Later that night, as Hans slept, Helga and Margaret sat by candlelight in the kitchen, speaking in whispers as they sorted through their meager food supplies. "We have enough potatoes for perhaps 4 more days if we stretch them," Helga calculated. "The barley can last another week." "And then?" Margaret asked, though they both knew there was no good answer. Helga reached for a small wooden box on the high shelf, bringing it down carefully. Inside was her wedding ring and a gold locket containing a photograph of her husband in his army uniform. He had been killed near Stalingrad in 1943, one of the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who never returned from the Eastern Front. "If we need to trade, these might help," she said softly, "though I don't know who would have food to spare now." "You can't trade Father's mementos," Margaret protested. "Your father would want us to survive," Helga said simply, closing the box. "Let's pray it doesn't come to that." The 784th Tank Battalion crossed into Germany on April 12, 1945, as part of the Allied advance that was now pushing deep into the crumbling Third Reich from both east and west. The spring weather had brought mud that challenged their Sherman tanks, but with the German forces in disarray they made steady progress. For Staff Sergeant Williams, entering Germany produced complicated emotions. They passed through villages that had been hastily abandoned, white sheets hanging from windows in surrender. Occasionally they encountered pockets of resistance, mostly Volkssturm militia, who fought briefly before surrendering or fleeing. "Hold up," Williams called to his driver as they approached a roadblock of felled trees outside a small town. He scanned the area through his binoculars, looking for signs of an ambush. "Peterson, Jackson, reconnaissance. Approach from the flanks, see what we're dealing with." The men dismounted and moved cautiously toward the barricade, weapons ready. Williams watched them through his binoculars, tense and alert. After years of combat, he had developed an almost supernatural sense for danger, and something felt wrong. "Movement at 2 o'clock, he murmured to his gunner. "Building with the red roof." Suddenly, a single rifle shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Jackson's feet. Before anyone could return fire, a white flag emerged from the building Williams had been watching, waved frantically by an elderly man. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" the man called in heavily accented English. "Hitler Youth, I stop him. No more shooting." Williams ordered his men to maintain their positions as the old man approached, hands held high. Behind him, a teenage boy in a Hitler Youth uniform was marched at gunpoint by a woman who appeared to be in her 60s, wielding an ancient hunting rifle with grim determination. "My grandson," the old man explained as they reached the tank. "His father, my son, killed in Russia. His mother killed in air raid. Foolish boy believes the lies. We want no more death." The teenager glared with a mixture of fear and defiance, tears streaming down his face. Williams recognized the look. A child forced to be a soldier, clinging to an ideology he barely understood because it was all he had left. Lieutenant Miller arrived in a jeep moments later, quickly assessing the situation. The old man explained that most of the town was ready to surrender, but a few Hitler Youth and party officials were trying to organize resistance. "They tell the people you will murder us all," the old man said, glancing uncomfortably at the black soldiers. "Especially, they say Negro soldiers are under orders to—" He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Miller's jaw tightened. "I understand. Please inform your town that we're here to occupy, not harm civilians. Anyone who doesn't resist will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. As they prepared to enter the town, Williams approached the teenage Hitler Youth member, who now sat under guard. His earlier defiance collapsed into silent tears. "What's your name, kid?" Williams asked. The boy looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. "Ernst," he answered after a moment's hesitation. Williams reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar, part of his rations he'd been saving. He unwrapped it and broke off a piece, offering it to Ernst. The boy stared at the chocolate with naked longing but didn't move to take it. "It's just chocolate," Williams said, "not poison." Ernst glanced at his grandparents, who nodded slightly. He took the chocolate cautiously, then quickly put it in his mouth, closing his eyes briefly at the taste, probably his first chocolate in years. "I have a son about your age back home," Williams lied, watching something shift in the boy's expression. He doesn't want to be fighting in a war either. 2 days later, the 784th reached the outskirts of Kleinstadt. Their advance had been relatively unopposed, though the battalion had suffered casualties from scattered snipers and improvised mines. Intelligence reported that the town had been abandoned by regular Wehrmacht forces, with only a small Volkssturm presence remaining. Lieutenant Miller gathered his platoon leaders for a briefing. "We'll secure the town sector by sector. Civilian control points will be established here, here, and here," he said, marking positions on a map. "All civilians are to be registered and screened for party membership. Remember, this is occupation, not combat. Rules of engagement are strict. Fire only if fired upon." He paused, looking specifically at Williams and the other black non-commissioned officers. "Be aware that there have been reports of specific propaganda regarding Negro troops. Maintain absolute professionalism at all times. Any incidents will be dealt with harshly. Understood?" The message was clear. They would be held to an even higher standard than their white counterparts, their actions scrutinized for any hint of impropriety that could confirm the German propaganda. As Williams returned to his tank crew, Corporal Peterson voiced what many were thinking. "So we fight our way across Europe, and now we got to worry about some Nazis saying we looked at them funny?" "Nothing new about that," Williams replied calmly, though he shared the frustration. "Just do your jobs right, same as always." The tanks rolled into Kleinstadt in the early morning hours of April 16th. Rather than the fierce resistance some had anticipated, they were met with eerie silence. White sheets hung from many windows, improvised flags of surrender. The few civilians visible scurried away at their approach, disappearing into buildings. Williams directed his tank toward the town square, maintaining a careful watch for ambushes. The square itself was dominated by a damaged church and the town hall, its facade still bearing a faded swastika banner that no one had dared to remove. As they secured the area, Williams noticed movement in a window, a woman's face quickly retreating from sight. It was a pattern repeated throughout the town, fearful observation followed by immediate withdrawal. By midday, military government officers had arrived to begin the formal occupation process. Announcements in German were made via loudspeakers, instructing civilians to remain in their homes except during specified hours, when they were to report to registration centers with identification papers. Dr. Brown was among the first to present himself to the American authorities, correctly assessing that as one of the town's few remaining professionals, his cooperation would be essential. Though visibly nervous in the presence of armed soldiers, particularly the black troops he'd been warned about, his medical skills made him too valuable to be hindered by propaganda fears. "We have approximately 1,200 civilians remaining in town," he informed the American captain through an interpreter. "Many are elderly, women, or children. Food supplies are critically low. Most have been surviving on less than 800 calories daily for weeks." The captain nodded, making notes. "We'll establish emergency ration distribution tomorrow. Medical supplies will arrive within 48 hours. In the meantime, I understand you're the only doctor." "Yes," Dr. Braun confirmed, "though I have 2 nurses assisting me. We've been operating from my home since the clinic was damaged in February." "You'll continue your work under military supervision," the captain informed him. "One of our medics will accompany you. We need to assess the general health situation immediately, particularly any communicable diseases." As Dr. Brown was escorted out, Williams watched the interaction with interest. In the doctor's nervous but practical demeanor, he recognized something familiar, a man adapting to survive, setting aside ideology in favor of immediate necessity. By evening, the town was fully under American control. The few Volkssturm members had surrendered without resistance, and only 3 Nazi Party officials had been detained, the rest having fled before the Americans arrived. Williams' platoon was assigned to guard the main registration center, where they would process civilians the following day. That night, as Williams wrote in his journal by flashlight, he recorded his impressions. Entered actual Germany today. Strange to be in the enemy's homeland after so much fighting to get here. Town seems broken, people look hungry and afraid. They watch us, especially us colored soldiers. With fear I've seen before, but something else too. Maybe curiosity. Maybe they're starting to realize they've been fed lies about us, same as we've been fed about them. Hard to hate people once you see how hungry their children are. Morning brought the first real interaction between the town's population and the occupying forces. Civilians began lining up at registration centers hours before they opened, clutching identity papers and ration cards. Military government officers had established clear protocols, verification of identity, brief interrogation regarding party membership and military service, issuance of temporary occupation currency, and information about curfews and restrictions. Helga and Margaret Weber joined the line outside the town hall, Hans between them. Helga had dressed them all in their cleanest remaining clothes, hoping to project dignity despite their circumstances. Around them, neighbors maintained a nervous silence, occasionally exchanging whispered observations about the American troops. "They're letting the colored ones guard us," murmured Frau Schmidt, an elderly widow who had lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front. "God help us all." "Quiet," Helga warned, glancing anxiously at her children. Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though her eyes took in everything, particularly the black American soldiers who maintained a professional distance, their expressions revealing nothing of their thoughts. As the line slowly advanced, Helga noticed something unexpected. A young mother ahead of them was struggling with a crying infant. One of the black soldiers, a tall man with sergeant's stripes, approached her. The woman visibly stiffened in fear. Instead of the threatening behavior Helga had been warned to expect, the soldier simply offered the woman a place to sit, bringing a wooden chair from inside the building and gesturing for her to use it. The woman hesitated, then sat gratefully, soothing her child. "Danke," she said quietly. The soldier nodded and returned to his position, the brief interaction witnessed by everyone in line. Helga felt something shift in the atmosphere, not dramatic but perceptible. A collective breath seemed to release. When they finally reached the front of the line, Helga handed their papers to a white American officer seated behind a desk. A young German man who spoke English served as interpreter. "Name and occupation?" the officer asked. "Helga Weber, widow. These are my children, Margarete and Hans." She hesitated before adding, "My husband was a teacher before he was drafted. He died at Stalingrad." The officer nodded without comment, examining their identity cards. "No party membership?" "No," Helga answered truthfully. Her husband had resisted joining the Nazi Party despite pressure, which had limited his career advancement before the war. "Current residence?" "Kirchstrasse 8. The upper floor was damaged in an air raid, but the ground floor is still habitable." The officer made notes, then stamped their papers. "You'll receive ration cards tomorrow. Distribution center will be at the school. Curfew is 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. Stay within town limits unless granted specific permission to travel." As they turned to leave, Hans tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry," he whispered. Staff Sergeant Williams, standing nearby, overheard. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a wrapped candy, offering it to Helga with a nod toward Hans. She stared at it for a long moment, torn between caution and her child's hunger. "Sugar for the boy," Williams said, keeping his voice gentle. "It's okay." Margaret stepped forward and accepted the candy with a quiet, "Thank you," then handed it to her brother. Helga's expression remained caught between gratitude and lingering fear as they left. Later that afternoon, Dr. Brown arrived at the Weber's home for his weekly check on Hans, who had suffered from respiratory problems since a bout of pneumonia the previous winter. He found Helga boiling water to sterilize bandages, a habit from her volunteer work at the hospital before it was destroyed. "The Americans have established a medical supply station," he informed her after examining Hans. "They're prioritizing children and the elderly. Bring him tomorrow. They have actual medicines, not just the substitutes we've been using." "Are they safe to approach?" Helga asked carefully. Dr. Braun understood her real question. "They're soldiers following orders, Frau Weber. Professional for the most part." He hesitated before adding, "The Negro medic assisting me is quite knowledgeable. Studied medicine at a university before being drafted." Helga absorbed this information, comparing it against everything she had been told to expect. "There was one today. A sergeant, I think. He gave Hans candy." Dr. Braun smiled faintly. "The Americans have supplies we haven't seen in years. Chocolate, coffee, white bread. Everyday items for them that have become luxuries for us." He stood to leave, collecting his worn medical bag. "The world has changed, Frau Weber. We must change with it or perish in the ruins of old ideas." After he left, Margaret helped her mother prepare their meager evening meal, soup made from potato peels and a few withered vegetables. As they ate, Hans suddenly asked, "Why were we supposed to be afraid of the black soldiers? The one today was nice." Helga and Margaret exchanged glances, neither knowing how to explain the complex layers of propaganda, racism, and fear to a child. Finally, Margaret said simply, "Because people often fear what they don't understand, Hans, and sometimes people in power use that fear to control others." "Like the party officials did?" Hans asked innocently. "Yes," Helga admitted quietly, "like they did." The next morning brought the promised food distribution. American supply trucks arrived carrying flour, powdered milk, canned meat, and other basic provisions. For the residents of Kleinstadt, who had been surviving on increasingly meager rations for months, the sight of so much food was almost overwhelming. Williams and his squad were assigned to oversee distribution, ensuring orderly lines and checking ration cards. The process was designed to be efficient, but the sheer logistics of feeding a hungry town created inevitable delays and confusion. Helga and her children joined the line early, Hans clutching his new ration card with excitement. "Real milk, Mama," he kept saying, "and white bread." As they waited, Helga noticed how differently people were reacting to the black American soldiers today. The terrified avoidance of yesterday had softened into cautious observation. Some even nodded in greeting when addressed, small gestures but significant given the years of propaganda they were unlearning. When they finally reached the distribution point, Williams recognized them from the previous day. "Morning, Ma'am," he said with a nod as he checked their ration cards. Helga managed a small, nervous smile in return. "Thank you for the candy yesterday, for my son." Williams seemed surprised by her direct acknowledgement but nodded. "No problem, Ma'am." As another soldier filled their allotment, more food than they'd seen in a single day for months, Margaret studied Williams with open curiosity. "You speak German?" she asked in careful English. "Just a few words," Williams admitted. "Picked up some phrases along the way." "I learned English in school," Margaret told him, her accent thick but understandable. Before everything." Williams smiled. "Your English is a lot better than my German." This small ordinary exchange, remarkable only for happening at all between people who days earlier had been mortal enemies, was observed by others in line. Something as simple as a conversation, devoid of the violence and brutality they'd been warned to expect, became its own kind of revelation. As April turned to May, a fragile routine developed in Kleinstadt. The Americans established a military government headquarters in the town hall, implemented work details for rubble clearance and basic repairs, and maintained regular food distribution. Civilians adapted to occupation rules while beginning the process of rebuilding their lives amid the physical and psychological ruins of the Third Reich. For the soldiers of the 784th, the pace shifted from the constant movement of advance to the more complex challenges of occupation. Williams found himself frequently interacting with the town's residents, particularly after Lieutenant Miller appointed him liaison for civilian work projects due to his calm demeanor and problem-solving abilities. One morning in early May, Williams was overseeing the clearance of rubble from a collapsed building when he noticed Dr. Braun approaching with two women in tow. "Sergeant Williams," Dr. Braun called. having become familiar with many of the American soldiers through his medical work. May I introduce Frau Weber and Fräulein Schmidt? They've volunteered to help establish a temporary medical station in the school building. But we need permission to use supplies from your medical officer. Williams recognized Helga immediately. The other woman, Fräulein Schmidt, was younger, perhaps in her 30s, with the competent air of someone accustomed to responsibility. Both were nursing assistants before the war, Dr. Brown explained. With so many children suffering from malnutrition and exposure, we need to expand our treatment capacity. Williams nodded. I'll take you to Captain Reynolds. He's coordinating medical services. As they walked toward the American headquarters, he added, We received additional supplies yesterday. Penicillin, too. Helga gasped softly. Real penicillin. We haven't had that in. I can't remember when. The boy with pneumonia. Your son? Williams asked, remembering Hans from the distribution line. That should help him considerably. You remembered, Helga said, surprised. Williams shrugged. Part of my job to keep track of the town's needs. At headquarters, Captain Reynolds readily approved their request, even adding additional supplies beyond what they'd asked for. As they prepared to leave with their authorization papers, Helga hesitated. Sergeant Williams, she said quietly, there are families in the Eastern Quarter who are too proud to come to the distribution center, mostly widows of officers. They're struggling, but accepting American charity feels like betrayal, Williams finished for her, understanding immediately. How many families? 7 that I know of, with 12 children between them. Williams considered this. We can't make special distributions, has to be fair, but maybe we can find them work at the center itself. Compensation would include extra rations. Helga smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. That would preserve their dignity. Thank you. As May progressed, the tentative interactions between occupiers and occupied gradually transformed. The initial fear gave way to pragmatic cooperation, then to cautious but genuine human connections. Children were the first to adapt, naturally drawn to the soldiers who had candy and played baseball in the town square during off-duty hours. Women followed, especially as they discovered that working with the Americans provided access to food and supplies their families desperately needed. For Williams and his fellow black soldiers, the experience created a profound irony they discussed in quiet conversations at night. Here, in the homeland of Nazism, they found themselves treated with a directness and growing respect often denied them in segregated America. Got a letter from my cousin in Mississippi yesterday, Jackson told Williams one evening as they shared cigarettes outside their barracks. Says nothing's changed back home. Came back from fighting in his uniform and still had to go around to the back door of the diner to get served. Williams nodded grimly. They'd all heard similar stories. Black veterans returning to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens despite their service. Strange world when Germans are starting to treat us better than some of our own folks back home. They were afraid of us at first, Peterson observed. Now they're just people trying to survive. Makes you think about how fear gets manufactured. Fear's always been the tool, and Williams replied. Question is who benefits from it? Their conversation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. They looked up to find Ernst, the Hitler Youth member they'd encountered when first entering German territory. Now employed as a messenger for the military government, he had become something of a fixture around the American headquarters. Sergeant Williams, he said with the half-formal, half-familiar tone he'd developed, Captain says the supply trucks will be delayed until tomorrow. The bridge at Hochstadt needs repairs. Thanks for the update, Williams replied. How's your grandfather doing? Better since the medicine, Ernst said. He asks if you will come for chess again. He says he must reclaim his dignity after losing 3 times. Williams laughed. Tell him Sunday, if duty allows. After Ernst left, Jackson shook his head in wonderment. 6 weeks ago, that kid was shooting at us. Now he's inviting you to play chess with his grandfather. World changes fast, Williams said simply. By late May, the immediate crisis of hunger had been addressed in Kleinstadt, though scarcity remained a daily reality. American supply chains had stabilized, bringing regular deliveries of basic necessities. More significant was the psychological shift among the town's residents, who had begun to face the reality of Germany's defeat and their own complicity, willing or unwilling, in the Nazi regime. Denazification procedures were implemented, requiring all adults to complete detailed questionnaires about their party involvement and activities during Hitler's rule. Classifications were assigned based on responses: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. The process was imperfect, with many Germans minimizing their involvement, but it forced a formal reckoning that few were prepared for. Dr. Braun, whose professional position had required nominal party membership, found himself classified as a follower, a relatively mild designation that allowed him to continue practicing medicine under supervision. Others fared worse, losing positions and privileges as their more enthusiastic support for the regime was documented. For the women of Kleinstadt, whose primary concern remained the immediate survival of their families, the process often seemed secondary to daily challenges. Yet they too were forced to confront questions about their role in the system that had brought such destruction. One evening in late May, Helga invited several neighbors to her home, including Margaret's friend Ilse, whose father had been a dedicated party member now interned in an Allied camp. The group had gathered to pool fabric for mending clothes, a practical necessity that also provided rare social connection. "They're asking impossible questions," Ilse complained, referring to her denazification questionnaire. "How can I know what my father believed? I was 14 when he joined the party. We never discussed politics at home." "We all saw things," Frau Schmidt said quietly, her fingers working steadily at her sewing. "The Jewish families that disappeared, the foreign laborers. We saw and said nothing." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. This kind of direct acknowledgement was still rare, though increasingly necessary as Germany confronted its recent past. "My husband used to say that silence is its own form of speech," Helga offered carefully. "By saying nothing, we said everything that was needed. And what choice did we have?" another woman demanded. "Should we have sacrificed our children to make meaningless protests?" Margaret, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke. "Perhaps there were no good choices. But shouldn't we at least be honest about that now? About our fear, our silence?" The older women exchanged glances, surprised by her directness. At 16, Margaret belonged to a generation that had known only Nazi rule, yet seemed somehow less entangled in its self-justifications than their parents. "The Americans ask these questions," Helga said thoughtfully, "but I wonder if they ask them of themselves as well. Their country has its own divisions, its own silences." She had learned much from conversations with the occupation forces, particularly about the segregation that the black soldiers faced at home. "At least they feed us," Frau Schmidt observed practically. "Whatever else they may be, they brought food when our own leaders left us to starve." Outside, the evening light was fading. Through the window, they could see American soldiers walking their patrol routes through the town. The occupation that had begun with such fear had become, improbably, a source of stability in a world turned upside down. As June began, a new phase of occupation emerged in Kleinstadt and throughout occupied Germany. With immediate humanitarian needs addressed and basic governance established, attention turned to longer-term recovery and the complex process of cultural and political re-education. For Staff Sergeant Williams, this transition brought new responsibilities. His evident skill in managing civil-military relations led to his appointment as liaison for the town's newly established community council, a first step toward returning governance to German civilians under Allied supervision. The council, comprised of non-Nazi professionals and community leaders, met weekly to address issues ranging from rubble clearance to school reopening. Braun served as interim chairman, while Helga Weber represented the town's eastern district, having emerged as a natural leader during the early weeks of occupation. At one such meeting in mid-June, Williams listened as council members debated the allocation of limited construction materials. The town hall had recently received a shipment of glass, lumber, and roofing materials, nowhere near enough to address all needs, but sufficient to begin priority repairs. "The school must be first priority," argued Friedrich Müller, a former teacher who had lost an arm on the Eastern Front. "Children have been without formal education for months." "What good is education if people freeze next winter?" countered Frau Schmidt. Residential repairs should come first, particularly for families with young children. Dr. Brown moderated with practiced diplomacy. Perhaps a compromise. The school's west wing for classrooms, with the east wing converted to temporary housing for those with uninhabitable homes. As the discussion continued, Williams noticed Helga watching him with a thoughtful expression. After the meeting concluded, she approached him directly. "You didn't intervene," she observed, even when Herr Fischer became quite heated about the distribution process. Williams smiled slightly. "Not my place to tell you how to rebuild your town. My job is to represent military government concerns, not dictate solutions." "But you have opinions," she pressed. "Of course. But part of why we're fighting this war is so people can govern themselves, isn't it? At least that's what we're told." Helga considered this. "It's strange. For years we were told exactly what to think, what to do. Now you Americans come as conquerors, yet insist we must learn to think for ourselves again." "Not conquerors," Williams corrected gently. "Occupiers. There's a difference." "Is there?" she asked with genuine curiosity. "I hope so," he replied. "Otherwise, what have we been fighting for?" As they walked together toward the town square, Williams asked about Hans, who had been responding well to American medical treatment. Their conversation, a German civilian and a black American soldier, discussing a child's health with genuine mutual concern, would have been unimaginable months earlier. Near the square, they encountered a group of American soldiers distributing chocolate to local children. Among them was Corporal Peterson, who had developed a reputation for organizing impromptu baseball lessons for Kleinstadt's youth. "Your soldiers," Helga observed, "particularly the Negro soldiers, they're very good with the children." Williams watched as Peterson demonstrated a batting stance to several enthusiastic boys. "Most of us come from communities where everyone helps raise the children, neighbors, extended family. It takes a village, we say." "We had a similar saying before the party decided children belong to the state first, family second," Helga replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. As they prepared to part ways, Helga hesitated, then spoke with careful deliberation. "I want to thank you, Sergeant Williams." "For what specifically?" "For showing us that what we were told about your people was a lie," she said simply. "It's one thing to discover your leaders were wrong about military matters, economic promises. It's another to find they lied about the very nature of human beings." Williams felt the weight of her words, not just personal gratitude, but acknowledgement of a deeper deception that had underpinned the entire Nazi worldview. "Truth has a way of emerging eventually," he replied, "even when buried under years of lies." The summer of 1945 brought significant changes to the occupation dynamics. In July, as the Allied leaders met at Potsdam to determine Germany's fate, the reality of divided occupation zones began to affect daily life. Kleinstadt fell within the American zone, but nearby towns and villages found themselves under French or British administration, creating complications for family connections and economic activity across these new boundaries. More immediately impactful for the residents of Kleinstadt was the development of a fragile but functional local economy. American authorities introduced occupation marks as currency, established regulated markets for essential goods, and gradually permitted limited private enterprise to resume. This economic revival, modest though it was, created new interactions between occupiers and occupied. Black market trading emerged despite official prohibition, with cigarettes and coffee becoming de facto currencies. American soldiers, particularly those from farming backgrounds, sometimes helped local farmers with equipment repairs, receiving fresh produce in exchange. For many German women, practical necessity overcame lingering propaganda fears completely. With most German men dead, missing, or in POW camps, American soldiers represented not just access to scarce goods, but also assistance with tasks requiring physical strength, repairing roofs, clearing debris, moving heavy furniture. On a warm July afternoon, Williams encountered Margaret Weber struggling to pull a handcart, loaded with salvaged bricks through the town square. Without asking permission, he moved to help, taking the handles from her. "Danke," she said, wiping sweat from her brow. "These are for our kitchen wall. Mother found them in the rubble by the church." Pretty heavy load for one person, Williams observed, pulling the cart with considerably less effort than she had shown. Mother is helping at the medical station today, Margaret explained, and there's no one else to ask. No men, she meant. The war had created a population drastically skewed by gender in Kleinstadt, as in most German towns. Women now performed most labor, from the traditionally feminine to the customarily masculine. "How's school coming along?" Williams asked, knowing that Margaret had returned to classes when the school partially reopened in June. "Strange," she admitted. "We have new textbooks from America. Our history teacher seems afraid to talk about anything that happened after 1933. She paused before adding, "Everything we were taught, it's all being unwritten now." "Must be confusing," Williams acknowledged. "Yes, but also," she searched for the word, "befreiend, liberating, to question everything, to decide for yourself what's true." As they reached the Weber's home on Kirchstrasse, Margarete gestured toward the damaged wall they were working to repair. Williams helped unload the bricks, arranging them neatly beside the house. "Would you like some water?" Margaret offered. "It's cool from the cellar." Williams accepted gratefully. Inside, the Weber home reflected the family's efforts to create normalcy amid scarcity. Carefully mended curtains hung at windows, partially covered with paper, where glass remained unavailable. Furniture showed signs of creative repurposing, a bookshelf made from ammunition boxes, chair cushions stuffed with shredded paper. Hans was sitting at the kitchen table, laboriously copying English phrases into a notebook. He looked up with a grin when he saw Williams. "Sergeant, look, I am learning English." Williams examined the boy's neat handwriting. "Very good," he praised. "Your pronunciation is better than my German." "Will you teach me more baseball words?" Hans asked eagerly. The American sport had become wildly popular among Kleinstadt's children, who played with improvised equipment under the tutelage of off-duty soldiers. "Maybe next time," Williams promised. "I should get back to headquarters now." As Margaret walked him to the door, she suddenly asked, "Is it true what they say about how Negro people are treated in America?" Williams was caught off guard by the direct question. "What have you heard?" "That you can't eat in the same restaurants as white Americans, that you have separate schools, separate sections on buses." Her expression was troubled. "It sounds like something familiar," Williams finished for her. The irony wasn't lost on him or any of the black soldiers fighting against Nazi racial ideology while coming from a country with its own rigid racial hierarchies. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Different from here in many ways, but yes, there's segregation, discrimination, things that contradict what America claims to stand for." "Then why did you fight for it?" It was a question Williams had wrestled with himself. "I fought for what America could be, should be, for my community's place in it, for the right to demand the country live up to its promises." He paused, "and to stop what was happening here." Margarete nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "The world makes less sense the more I learn about it." Williams smiled slightly. "That's how you know you're learning something worthwhile." By August, a significant evolution had occurred in Kleinstadt's relationship with the occupation forces. The initial terror had given way to cautious cooperation, then to pragmatic partnership, and finally to something approaching normal human interaction, albeit within the constraints of a defeated nation under military control. Food remained scarce by pre-war standards, but was now consistently available through both official distribution and a growing network of small farms resuming production. More Germans found employment with the occupation administration, gradually rebuilding municipal services and infrastructure. For Williams and the other soldiers of the 784th, the nature of their duties had transformed as dramatically as the civilians' perception of them. Combat veterans now found themselves acting as de facto civil administrators, cultural ambassadors, and even teachers. Williams himself had begun offering English lessons twice weekly at the school, while several of his squad members coached sports and helped with rebuilding projects. On August 14th, momentous news reached Kleinstadt. Japan had surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II was finally, officially over. For the American soldiers, this meant eventual redeployment and for many return home. For the Germans, it represented the formal beginning of an uncertain post-war era, now irrevocably shaped by total defeat. That evening, the Americans organized a modest celebration in the town square, not to gloat over victory, but to mark the end of a conflict that had claimed tens of millions of lives worldwide. Local residents were invited to attend, creating an unusual scene of former enemies acknowledging the war's end together. Williams found himself standing beside Helga Weber as they watched American and German children playing together near the makeshift bandstand where several musically inclined soldiers performed jazz standards. "It doesn't feel real yet," Helga admitted, "that it's truly over." "War ends on paper before it ends in people's minds," Williams replied, thinking of his father's lingering nightmares from the previous war. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just immediate plans. "For us, most will rotate home eventually. For Germany, reconstruction under Allied supervision for some time." "Will you go home soon?" Williams shrugged. "Orders haven't come down yet. Black units often get held longer for occupation duty." Helga nodded, having learned much about American racial dynamics through conversations with the soldiers. "Your country doesn't know what it has in men like you," she said, with unexpected directness. "Men who showed more humanity to former enemies than our own leaders showed to us." Before Williams could respond, Hans ran up to them, breathless with excitement. "Mama, they're giving out real ice cream. Sergeant Peterson says I can have some if you say it's okay." Helga laughed, a free, genuine sound that Williams realized he'd never heard from her before. "Yes, of course." As Hans darted away, Helga's expression grew serious again. "I've been meaning to ask you something. Sergeant Williams, something difficult." "Go ahead." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "When you first arrived, we were terrified. We'd been told such horrible things specifically about Negro soldiers that you would." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know what you were told," Williams said quietly. "How did you bear it, knowing what we believed about you?" "I would have been so angry." Williams considered the question thoughtfully. Propaganda wasn't invented by the Nazis, Frau Weber. Back home, we've had generations of people believing terrible things about us. You learn to prove them wrong through actions, not arguments. "Your patience shames me," she said softly. "Not patience," he corrected. "Persistence. Different thing entirely." The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Miller, who approached with news for Williams. "Just got word, Sergeant. We're being rotated to Frankfurt next month. New occupation assignment." After Miller left, Helga processed this information with visible concern. "Frankfurt is far. Who will replace you here?" "Other American units. The occupation continues, just with different faces." "It won't be the same," she said simply. In the days that followed, news of the 784th's impending departure spread through Kleinstadt. The unit that had entered as feared conquerors would leave as something far more complicated, not quite friends, given the context of occupation, but certainly no longer enemies. The town council organized a modest farewell gathering, notable for being German-initiated rather than American-imposed. In the school auditorium, which had been partially restored through joint efforts, Dr. Brown delivered a carefully worded address that acknowledged the complex relationship that had developed. "You came as representatives of victory over a regime that had led Germany into darkness," he told the assembled American soldiers. "You stayed as participants in the first steps toward rebuilding. For this, for your fairness, your assistance, and particularly your treatment of our children, we offer sincere gratitude." Following the formal proceedings, a simple meal was shared. Contributions from both American supplies and local production, creating a symbolic breaking of bread between former adversaries. Children presented hand-drawn cards to soldiers who had become their teachers and coaches. Williams found himself the recipient of several such tokens, including an elaborately folded paper airplane from Hans Weber and a carefully written English poem from Margarete. As families mingled with soldiers in small conversational groups, he observed Helga speaking intently with Lieutenant Miller near the doorway. When she approached Williams afterward, her expression was determined. "I've asked Lieutenant Miller about sending packages," she explained, "after you return to America, for Hans and other children. He says it would be permitted once postal services are properly restored." Williams was touched by the gesture. The idea of maintaining some connection beyond the artificial relationship of occupier and occupied. That would be nice. The kids would appreciate hearing how things are progressing here. Helga nodded, then added with sudden emotion, I want you to know, not just you personally, but all of you, that you've taught us something beyond English lessons or baseball rules. What's that? That everything we were told about human difference was a lie, she said simply. That the categories they created to separate us are meaningless compared to how we treat one another. This seems a small lesson now, but for Germans to relearn it, it may be the most important part of rebuilding. On their final day in Kleinstadt, as the 784th prepared for departure, Williams took a solitary walk through the town that had been his home for nearly 5 months. The physical changes were evident: rubble cleared, essential services restored, markets functioning with limited goods. But the psychological transformation was more profound and harder to quantify. Children waved to him by name as he passed. Shopkeepers nodded in recognition. Elderly men who had initially hidden from black American soldiers now engaged in halting conversations using phrasebook English and hand gestures. The fear that propaganda had cultivated had dissolved through daily human interaction, the most natural and yet radical refutation possible. At the Webers' home, William stopped to say a personal goodbye. Hans threw himself into a hug with the unself-conscious affection of childhood, while Margaret offered a more reserved but equally sincere farewell. Helga presented Williams with a small package. Just a token, she said, to remember Kleinstadt. Later, in the privacy of his quarters, Williams unwrapped the gift, a small wooden box containing a hand-carved chess piece. A note explained that it had been made by Ernst's grandfather from a fallen oak beam in their home. The king piece was carved in a style that incorporated elements of both European and African design, a thoughtful, symbolic gesture that moved Williams deeply. As the convoy prepared to depart the following morning, residents gathered along the main street. Not in fear as they had when the Americans arrived, but in acknowledgement of a shared chapter now closing. Williams, standing in the lead vehicle, surveyed the faces he had come to know. Dr. Brown, Ernst and his grandparents, the Weber family, and dozens of others whose initial terror had transformed into something no propaganda had prepared them for: recognition of common humanity. Helga stepped forward as the engine started, handing up a package of homemade bread for the journey. "Godspeed, Sergeant Williams," she said formally, but her eyes conveyed more complex emotions: gratitude, respect, and acknowledgement of a truth too significant to articulate fully. As the convoy pulled away, Williams watched Kleinstadt recede in the side mirror. The town was still damaged, still recovering, still facing an uncertain future, but no longer trapped in the ideological prison that had helped create the war. In his journal that evening, writing by flashlight in temporary quarters in Frankfurt, Williams reflected, "Left Kleinstadt today after 151 days. Strange to think how much has changed since we rolled in back in April. Not just the town itself, but the people, and us too, if I'm honest. They expected monsters because that's what propaganda told them to expect. We expected unrepentant Nazis, and found hungry people trying to make sense of a collapsed world. Propaganda works until proximity destroys it. Hard to believe a caricature when the actual person is standing in front of you, showing normal human decency. Harder still to maintain hate when your hungry child is accepting candy from the very people you were taught to fear. Most of these Germans never met a Negro before we arrived. Their entire understanding came from Nazi lies. It took just days for those lies to start crumbling, weeks for cautious trust to form. By the time we left, the children were playing baseball with us. The mothers were asking for cooking tips. The old men were challenging us to chess, not because we're special, but because we're normal, the very thing propaganda said we weren't. There's a lesson here that goes beyond this particular war or these particular peoples. When you want people to hate each other, you keep them separate. When you want healing, you bring them together. Simple as that. The most powerful weapon against propaganda isn't counter-propaganda, it's proximity. I wonder what America could learn from this. Back home they keep us separate too. Different neighborhoods, schools, water fountains, different everything. Is it any wonder fear and suspicion flourish? What might change if that separation ended? If people could just see each other as people? Tomorrow we start a new assignment, but I won't forget Kleinstadt. Not because our work there was exceptional, but because it showed how exceptional ordinary human connection can be when given a chance to overcome artificial divisions. If there's hope for rebuilding after this terrible war, maybe it starts with that simple truth. 3 months later, in November 1945, a package arrived for Williams at his parents' home in Philadelphia. He had been discharged in October and was adjusting to civilian life while using the GI Bill to resume the engineering studies interrupted by his draft notice years earlier. The package, having traveled a convoluted route through military postal services, contained a letter from Helga Weber and photographs of Kleinstadt showing ongoing reconstruction. Hans had included a carefully written note in English describing his progress in school, while Margareta enclosed a newspaper clipping about the town's first democratic local election since before Hitler's rise to power. Most surprising was a formal letter from Dr. Braun, who had been elected mayor in that very election. He wrote of continued challenges, but also of a community rebuilding not just physically, but culturally and morally. The final paragraph read, "You may be interested to know that our town council recently voted unanimously to establish a community center in the repurposed Nazi Party headquarters. The center will include a library with books previously banned, meeting spaces for democratic civic organizations, and educational programs. In acknowledgement of how our community's recovery began, we have named it the Friendship House. The children's reading room will feature a small plaque commemorating the 784th Tank Battalion, whose members taught us that the divisions created between peoples cannot withstand the simple power of shared humanity. Your unit's example continues to influence our community's development long after your departure, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective occupation is of minds and hearts, not merely territory." Williams replied with his own updates and continued to correspond with several Kleinstadt residents for years afterward. The connections formed during those months of occupation, begun in fear, evolved through necessity, and ultimately transformed by recognition of common humanity, represented a small but significant counterpoint to the hatred that had fueled the war. As Germany and America both moved forward from World War II, each dealing with their own contradictions around race, democracy, and human rights, these small bridges between former enemies served as reminders that propaganda's power, though immense, remains vulnerable to humanity's most basic capacity: the ability to see ourselves in others once artificial barriers are removed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.